Episode with George Gantz, and I'm Daniel Sanderson, and here we are talking about consilience and consciousness. So we're moving right along. I think we're on episode number not episode, but we're on chapter 8, and this particular chapter from E.O. Wilson on his book Conciliance is focusing on human nature, and I kind of hit a wall with this one, George, but in a good way. I'll explain that in a minute. What was your kind of thought into this chapter?
Well, I like this chapter in the sense that it was an effort to tease out the relationship between nature and nurture, and the genetic basis for for life, our own lives, and then how that has a complicated set of interactions with epigenetics, which was we're still working on getting the understanding of that correct in terms of how that all plays out, and then seeing how humans have been shaped by both the environment and the culture and the underlying genetic changes to be what we are. So I kind of like that feature of it. There is a book that I think has updated what E.O. Wilson was talking about. As a matter of fact, I think I can reach it, and I don't know if I showed this to you before, but it's Nicholas Christakis, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. So he's looking at how the development of the qualities of human beings that allow them to cooperate and join together, and all of the things that are necessary for building society on trust and love and those kinds of qualities, really was a result of the evolutionary process for a human being. So I think it's a pretty good review of what E.O. Wilson was trying to drive at in this chapter. That we are partly the way we are as human beings because we had to find our way to navigate in a very complicated environment, a fitness landscape, and that's has one could say that process has brought out the better sides of ourselves, as Pinker says, the better angels of our nature. What was the phrase that Pinker used?
Yeah, I always fumble that football too, but it is the better angels of our nature, and I think it was something that came from John Locke, I believe. I'm not sure. It's an easy one to look up, right? It's just for some reason,
but we're too lazy.
We're being lazy or something.
Yeah. So where did you struggle? Where did you have some difficulty with this chapter?
Well, the theme of the book is consilience and a jumping together, and I was thinking, is the George perspective and the Daniel perspective, are we coming together in a synthesis and a consilience of sorts? And I think I understand. I think I understand how you approach the book and how there's a strong religious piece, and then from my standpoint, I've got a strong materialistic bias, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I think we're really saying the same thing, but I'd like to be able to articulate it that way.
Yeah.
And my concern is that it's multifold. So one of my concerns is that I can read his book, and I can read it and reread it and reread it and keep picking up things over and over again, right? So my concern is that I want to be able to get through this series and feel that we've got a very, very strong command of what the book is about. And I think in one level we have that, and in another level I think we don't have that, right? Because I go back and I look at some of what we've talked about and some of our criticisms, and I think if I really listen carefully to what E.O. Wilson is talking about and how he's presenting his arguments, I think he acknowledges the criticisms that we are putting forward. Right? He never. To give you an example, so in this particular chapter on human nature, it's kind of a follow up to his Pulitzer Prize book that he wrote on human nature in, I think it was 1974. Which, if you think about when that was actually written, I was born in 1975, and for someone as a scientist like him to have this, I just have such an utmost respect for how this man put this together, right? And when I go through the material again and again, and I listened and I read through what he's saying, it's not that I think he's just bang on, because he's absolutely bang on. But the nuance of what he's talking about, I think there's some stuff that we can expand upon, or that we're not. I don't know if we're really kind of giving it its full due and respect and props, right?
Well, I'd love to hear more if you want to be more specific. I've got my own sense of where he where he and I might see things a bit differently. And we've kind of talked about that before. I think his picture is incomplete for some of the reasons that I think are valid. But that doesn't necessarily undermine, a lot of what he's saying. And I think this chapter, I didn't have the same kind of difficulty as I have in a couple of chapters coming up. So, I felt pretty comfortable with the basic thrust of it, and felt that he avoided tripping too much on some of the areas where I think he has a blind spot. As we talked before, he has a faith in the project of explaining everything through a reductionist scientific method, and I think it has been very successful in physics, chemistry. It's beginning to be more effective in the more complex levels of medicine and biology. And it becomes more and more difficult as you move up the layers from the physical to the chemical to the biological to the psychological to the social to the to the artistic and creative. As you move up those levels, it becomes much more difficult, I think, to hold together to his rather strict approach to everything having a reductionist explanation, from cause and effect, from cause at the physical level, all moving itself up through all these layers in a way that's going to be explainable in a reductionist fashion. So, it's not. I think this chapter is a good one, because it does pull together some of the elements in a way that at the time was new. But I think trying to take that method and force fit it onto some of the other following chapters is a more difficult enterprise, and I don't think he quite does it.
Yeah, I don't want to box myself in and label his project as being reductive. Like I think it's far from that. I mean,
well, he says it is.
Hmm.
He says that the ultimate way of understanding is to use the reductive method, and break the pieces down into their components, and then those components down until you can explain it at the physical level. So that's the way he describes his own method. I think sometimes he's very, very well read, very bright, and so he can create a narrative that addresses a lot of different parts of sort of the non-reductive aspects of life and humanity. But that's not what he says his project is.
Yeah, but I guess let me maybe explore it from this sort of standpoint and say, maybe I share that sort of Ionian enchantment, and I wouldn't want to be labeled as as reductive in my approach, because, but on the same token though, George, I mean, the thing is that if I'm looking at human knowledge before Mendelian, I think the genetics, right, where we labeled, um, I guess, characteristics as a blend of parents, as opposed to, um, now what we know about, and through observation, what we know through, um, uh, through genetics, we know about kind of the all or nothing kind of propositions of DNA, and this approach is much different. And if we would have, I think he's just prompting us to say that we need to try. We don't know what we're going to discover, right? And so there seems to be um, a portion of the warning sign that comes from your wisdom that says, well, there's some things that we just will never know. Like, don't try to do that. We can't reduce it down to something. Right now, that same position could have been, taken by the monks from the Mendelian, colleagues, to say, hey, you know what, this is something that we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be analyzing, and doing experiments with, pea shoots, and planting things and observing them and applying them to, through observation, and trying to do a framework in that particular way.
Yeah.
And,
As a practical matter, as an empirical matter, I am in agreement. But where I have pause is when I see what is clearly a metaphysical commitment to a methodology. So, and the inability to talk about or look at the faith propositions that are built into that metaphysic. So, reductionism as a metaphysical principle about the approach to knowledge is a box that I don't think E.O. Wilson is able to step out of, and I think others are in the same boat. They can't step out of that to ask questions or to look at ways that that those are limiting.
well, let's go there for a minute.
Yeah.
Let's go there for a minute, because he does talk about, in the book, he does talk about, complexity theory, and he talks about the Santa Fe Institute, and that's something that you advocate for, and you look at in complexity theory, and so he's not discounting that.
Well,
But
actually, he does. He does. He was fairly critical about Stuart Kaufman and the work that has become part of the
right, he was, yeah.
Institute, because it does have a thread to it of trying to understand, a complex system, dynamic complex system, as its properties emerge, does not seem to follow the reductionist model, because as the system reaches that point where complex dynamic system in play, new behaviors, unexpected results, unexpected behaviors that cannot be, the intelligence reflected in the construction of a cathedral termite mound in Australia. I mean, that, it's 1 million individuals. They don't have any intelligence. And so there is something that goes on in the process of the interaction of those individuals in such great numbers, and network effects and scale effects, and new behaviors emerge at the level of the termite mound, where the termite mound then is taking care of the individual termites, which they've created. And so what it's the old chicken and egg. What comes first? Does the order and structure and intelligence of the termite mound come first, or does the behavior of the termites, how does that get to that intelligence? So this is an example where reductionist causal thinking isn't helpful, and he's critical of that in Stuart Kaufman's early work. So I think in a way this is a complexity theory is an example of a new kind of science that tries to take a look at the whole and the parts, and look at the properties of the part-whole properties that are reflected in there. And it's got some differences in terms of how one traces the causal path. It's not reductionist in the same way that E.O. Wilson is. So this is an example where I think there's an expansion of the metaphysics about looking at complex systems that E.O. Wilson and others really aren't comfortable with.
And George, I'm going to disagree with you, because the thing is that he's the one that's fighting against, him along with Charles Lumsden, that put forth the group selection concept and research about altruism. His whole body of work of eusociality, right? Coming from insects and observing them, from a group dynamic, is not that kind of reductionist methodology that you're referring to, right? He didn't do it in that, he's been under tremendous pressure because of his group selection, right? At first it was discounted, and then it kind of resurfaced again, right? I guess it was originally brought in under kin selection, and then, or the other way around. But this is describing eusociality is basically his mark on history, right? So he's describing entire species and how species interact as a group. And, that doesn't seem to me to be reductionist in any way. He certainly got his, it seems to be like the holy grail of irrefutable evidence to be able to say that you found the golden nugget, like you found the, in the ant species, you actually found the pheromone that actually gets the ant to go left, right, up and down, jump up and down, and, predicts all their behaviors, right? Because then you don't have any disagreement. Then you have irrefutable, immutable. This is the holy grail in terms of what a scientist can go after, because there's no more argument in it. So wouldn't it be nice to have that kind of, scientific discovery? This is what, scientists are trying to discover, right? And the patterns and the metaphysics that presuppose that, and you can even say like that metaphysics is that imagined space that takes you to that spot.
And it's a good question about whether he, I think he explains the metaphysics of reductionism, but it does seem to be the case that he doesn't always follow it. And I think the eusociality example is a good one, where it's a complex process as to how that evolves, and the he's been able to explain it and explain it in a way that's now generally accepted, um, even though it doesn't, I don't think it, I don't think it necessarily fits his metaphysic. So, you know, he's, you can say that he is a complex individual, like all great explorers and designers and inventors and breakthrough scientists. Um, uh, and this may be an example where his breakthrough was not necessarily quite the kind of breakthrough he thought, or he just thinks about it a little differently. I don't know how to characterize that. It's a little bit like under Thomas Kuhn's example of paradigm shifting. Um, he's got a way of thinking about his paradigm that really isn't the same thing as the way he actually practices.
Okay. All right. Well, let's spend a little bit of time on that because I get like it's such a reoccurring thread. I think with how you identify with with material. Okay, and so I almost want to just like let you loose on it and say, all right, well, what does this look like then? If the book was rewritten under, like it was E.O. Wilson and George Gantz, right?
Well, I
Like you're
guess
the co-author in
this
it.
the simplest thing would be um, if you could rewrite it in such a way as to express it as a co-discovery. Um, he's not always very forgiving about you know the the past points of view because they didn't meet the standard of the day of our day. Um, but everybody has gone through a process of learning and evolving. Our mental constructs are evolving, our science is evolving, our views of the world are evolving, and yeah, there are times when things are not helpful, when people get stuck, both in science and outside of science, and that's not helpful when people get stuck. But if we can have a co-discovery where yeah, you can help biologists think differently, so they're not struck excuse me, simply struck with the categorization example of just categorizing based on physiology, but you can bring to them a deeper understanding of what the genetic factors are, so you can start recharacterizing. Well, that's been happening, and it's a 100 to 200 year process.
Mm.
Um, so it's not a fact that so and so is wrong, and you've got to use this method. It's more like a process of co-discovery and working together. I mean, the those who spent so much time categorizing based upon physiology were not mistake. That was valuable work that was done, even though it needed to be modified when we started to get a more sophisticated understanding of the genetic basis. And now we're understanding that even the categorizations on genetics are, there's some gray areas, and you don't know what a species is. It's kind of a gray area. So um,
Mm.
and I think the same thing in the later chapters, where he talks about um, social trends and art and things like that. It's his the way he characterizes it is that he's bringing his methodological approach to it, and that's going to solve all those problems. And he's going to be able to create an environment where he can start from the physical and then explain the process, resynthesize, break it all down to its reductionist core, and then resynthesize all the way back up again with that method. And I that's the way he talks about it. And I don't think that's the way the process of co-evolving knowledge and understanding works, even in the sciences.
Oh, I see.
more of
Okay.
an
Yeah.
organic process where, okay, so we have certain ways of thinking about things, and then we get more information, we get more insights, and we can start to develop a better understanding of it. But that's there are some times when you have to be whole to part rather than part to whole, and it's uh, so I don't know if that's helpful. I would, if he were approaching consilience from the point of view of saying, well, what is it that we know in this sphere of human activity, and how can that inform, what we understand from this sphere, and can we bring these things together in a consilience? But he seems a little more determined to map his methodological process onto everybody else, and that feels a little bit off-putting, to put it mildly.
Hmm.
You're, so anyway, that's.
Well, I don't know if anybody else is offering any other system, though, right? It's like the guy's a pioneer and a living legend, and he's offering something, and people say, well, so what's the better way to do it? Well, I don't know. Just let it happen. Just let it, just roll with it. It's just going to work out this way. We don't know. It just has to just let it go, and I'm like, what's the better way? What's the
Well,
system?
I don't know if it's a better way. It's just a better style. It's a better approach. Let me use the example of 20th century medicine. Okay, causal, reductionist-based 20th century medicine. And it literally threw out all of the cultural practices that had been built up in certain cultures over thousands of years as worthless, because it wasn't based upon Western causal medical practices and tests, and double blind, and and so it threw it all out. And what that failed to understand is that if human beings for 3,000 years have been practicing certain types of practices, from acupuncture to shamanic tradition, they wouldn't have held on. The human race is not stupid and would not have held on to those practices if it had no efficacy. So, coming at the traditional folk practices and folk medicine with an eye towards, well, what is it in that folk practice or folk medicine that does have value? What can we tease out if we bring our scientific empiricism to it? What can we tease out to help explain why this has survived those thousands of years, rather than simply throw it out wholesale? And I think that was a mistake in Western medicine that now the science is beginning to catch up with. So there's an understanding that there are sophistication that Western medicine wasn't able to see, that was in some cases baked into folk practices that do have value. So that might be an example of the kind of the methodological arrogance that can come in to scientific practices that really is pretty unfortunate.
Yeah. All right. Well, no, I get that. I mean, I go back to the Greek, and they had more of a holistic culture, and so when certainly they didn't have the advancements medically, but they would look at other things like, so George, you're not feeling good, so how are things at home? What are like they'd bring in everything into, like, where do you sit? Where are your virtues? How are you balancing your psycho? Basically, they wouldn't use the word psychology, but you understand. There's a whole container that makes George, and they would try to describe that whole piece, as opposed to I guess just isolate the one the one piece, right? So,
Right, and the holistic concept is again, um, the difference between whole to part and part to whole kind of thinking. And I think it's important that we bring more holistic thinking into our efforts to understand the world, understand humans, understand life, and try and figure it all out. And I think that's one of my primary concerns about the Western scientific approach, the Western medicine approach, the Western approach of methodological reductionism, and also there's a hard edge of determinism involved in that too, because it's that faith in that causal chain, the deterministic causal chain, as the explanation that we're searching for in everything. And a lot of people believe it to the point of believing in functional determinism.
mm,
So that chops out a lot of human experience when you do that. And I think we don't want to do that. I think we need to be able to understand the human experience is a holistic experience. And so let's use our best tools to try and explain all of that, but don't think that you have the only and the right answer. And
yeah, I just it feels like we're saying that over and over again, and that's the point where I almost feel like saying you could put it at a disclaimer at the beginning of the book. Just don't use a solely methodological sort of reductionist methodology. Done. Period. Move on. Right. But
yeah,
you can still use the methodology and then bring back the more, because there's a difference between implementation, right? If you understand what the uh, what a the through isolation, and you come up with a what would it be, like a discovery like insulin or something. That didn't come from a holistic approach. Medicine didn't work that way, right? Like, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. So now, if you want to implement it into society, right, and you need nurses that need to be empathetic, and there's all sorts of things that we need to implement it, fair enough. But I don't know if you, so I'm not sure if you knew, but the IPCC, would just switch gears just a little bit about the environment. They've come out with their, I guess, groundbreaking report on the environment. Okay. So the scientists are doing the reports. Okay. So they have the reports. Now there's a bigger picture, probably to like several orders of magnitude difference here about what the environment is doing, right? And what the scientists report versus what we do about it. And so the scientists, it's like not their role to do that. Like, that's up to society to figure out what to do with it. That doesn't mean their methodology is supposed to be something that's non-scientific so that we can come up with something, because it's diluted before it even gets to the people. It's impregnated with ideology before it even gets to somebody. So you have the scientific body that says, here's the science. Now it's up to you guys to figure out what to do with it. Now, what does that mean? There's a net zero carbon emissions by 2050. What does that mean for your grandchildren? The IPCC doesn't say anything about that.
I'm having a little trouble with that theoretical construct of science do their own things, and they explain it, and then they're hands off. Well, that's you guys figure it out. um yeah, I think there's a responsibility about if you know something, you have a responsibility to share that. And I think scientists are doing that in climate change, and they're working very hard. And there are some um, forces that are, you know, resisting for
Mm,
reasons that are pretty clearly selfish.
mm,
Um, and self-serving. So I don't know if that's a particularly good example. I don't like the model of, scientists sort of being in an ivory tower and coming out with their, this is the way things work and you guys figure it out. I don't think that's the kind of society we want to live in. I think we all want to be scientists. We all want to be inquirers. We all want to be curious, and we all want to um, uh, find a way to understand who to trust and who not to trust when it comes to information. And I think, transparency, multiple sources, replicability, there are a whole host of things that in the scientific enterprise that go into providing more credibility to some findings than to others. Um, and that's one of the great things about the scientific enterprise. It's probably the greatest human institution on the face of the earth, and it's something that is fundamentally egalitarian and democratic in the sense that you test scientific theories about whether they're valid and validated and consistently so, and not based upon the emperor's edicts or the edicts of politicians. So I think it's a large part of why the human civilization has been able to go so far so quickly in the last couple of centuries. And you don't want to lose that. But I also have problems when again, the methodological approach that works in physics doesn't have the same value in biology, and it doesn't have the same value in sociology, complex systems. So you have to look at ways of bringing your best to each of these disciplines. And there is a tendency among scientists, some scientists, and E.O. Wilson is one, of, well, this works. I know this works. This works here. And so we're just going to, pull it over and cover all of the human enterprise. I think it's more complicated than that. And as you go up the chain to start dealing with things dealing with humans, conscious humans, sentient humans, the institutions they create, the enterprises they engage in, the activities they do, the creativity they bring. I don't think his methodology is going to hold.
Yeah.
We need new approaches and new sciences, and complexity theory being one that is bringing new ideas to the fore. And there are the conundrums in quantum physics and mathematics that nobody's going to be able to solve. There are always going to be, it's going to be an infinite exploratory enterprise, and I think we need to recognize some of those limits and recognize that it's not going to provide all answers, and so we have to do the best we can to solve that. But don't take a particular scientific approach and present it as a solution to all areas of where we need knowledge. I don't know. I don't think I'm articulating it very well, but it's
Yeah, and that's the point that I'm trying to flesh out. It may seem like I'm a little argumentative today but it not intentionally. It's just I'm stuck on this because every time I read his book, and I can reread it over and over again, I try not to simplify his perspective, and I think there's a great depth to what he's writing. And so I'm saying I can reread it again, and each time I pick up something new in terms of a framework, a greater sort of greater depth for understanding, right? And I don't know if we're capturing it here. I don't know if we're preemptively being, got to think of our responsibility to the listeners. They're going to go and check out this book and check out E.O. Wilson, right? And they get from us that basically E.O. Wilson is, oversimplifies and thinks that the science is going to figure this all out. I think there's lifetimes that can be put into what E.O. Wilson is putting forward here. I think he's greatly discounted even in the scientific community. I think he's an enormous giant that people should be spending way more time investigating. I don't know how many times, George, I sit there and I talk to somebody and I say, hey, have you heard of E.O. Wilson? Well, you're my friend and you've said, yes, of course, I've read his book. How many people say, I don't know who you're talking about? So many people. I have so many people I talk to and they're like, what? Who's that? I mean, from his Conciliance project to his Half Earth project to, his work on ants and eusociality, like the guy's a living giant. And it's like, I don't want to preemptively have anybody listen to the show and think, yeah, he's being, like he's being too scientific and I'm not going to investigate him. Right? He's somebody that you could have lifetimes of investigation on. And I do. And I find that I go back to his books, I read it again, and I think that's amazing. That's amazing how you've done that. And to just simplify him like that, I think is just an oversimplification. And I think about the responsibility that we have for readers and listeners to this, to go, wait, that's just not, because where's their next stop?
So, what I don't understand is where, in terms of his scientific acumen, his his judgment in those areas, what he's brought to the table, I have no disagreement. But where he goes and spends, the chapter on the humanities, or on art, or on, he's not dealing in areas where he has specific expertise. And I think scientists do this a lot when some of the popular science writers in physics and stuff like that, Time's Arrow is one. I can't remember, was that Brian Greene or one of the other ones, where they're taking what they know in the science and now they're delving into metaphysics, and they're doing popular writing with a that's off the reservation, if you want to say it, into areas where they're just speculating.
But that's what we
that doesn't that speculation from a philosopher's point of view is no better than the speculation of somebody off the street.
Fair enough. I'll give you that.
It's out of their sphere of expertise, and again, I think a lot of it has to do with the extrapolation of methodological constructs that work within a specific area of knowledge building that doesn't necessarily transfer into all other areas of knowledge building.
No, I get that, but you're in some respect, you see the bit of the contradiction or the irony at play here. We don't want the scientists to just do that. I mean, I know that's what I said before, and actually, I will give you that. I will say that I would like to see more climate scientists actually take one hat and say, okay, here's the science, and take the other hat and say, here's what I think we should do about it, right? I wish those leaders would do that. Now, in this particular case, when you have a scientist who's, like E.O. Wilson, and he wants to talk about art, well, this is exactly what I think you're fundamentally saying, is that you have to bring in other aspects to beauty and culture, and have the scientists talk about them in a way that's not just like, well, that's the domain of the artists. Here's my domain. So you want to have his opinion. You want to have a pluralistic opinion. You want to have more conjecture. You want to have all of that come together. And if there's no way that you can synthesize it, then you just look at the big, pretty picture and you go, nothing we can do about it. Let's move on. Right?
No,
that's kind of right. The idea.
We're not in agreement. Um, and I,
Well, I'm trying to describe what I'm seeing you say though, right? Because you say that E.O. Wilson can't. He's in no position to describe art because with the methodology that you think that he's describing art from a purely like scientific standpoint, and I don't know if that's the case.
but he says he is. That's the, so
Hmm.
it's a, it's um, a characterization that he makes of himself that I'm criticizing,
Okay.
and it's the characterization is primarily the methodological one, and he uh, he is vociferous in his attacks against anyone who looks at it differently or thinks there might be a different way to think about it. That's where my
Hmm.
problem is. I don't think that level of, it's a kind of hubris and arrogance that because of his expertise in science, he feels qualified to delve into. And the same thing is true of other popular science writers where, they've got an area of expertise and they seem to feel qualified to go out and then attack based upon that that set of perceptions they have. And I think the new atheists were a good example of that. You know, there was no there was no sensitivity to what values may be even from an evolutionary standpoint, what values may be embedded in religion. You know,
Hmm.
what is the best, if we look at these things from the better point of view as opposed to the worst point of view, what is it that humanity has gained here? There's evolutionary advantage, there's positive aspect to it, and you and I both agree in the importance of virtue. So, you know, uh, there are ways of looking at biology and evolution as uh, Christakis does that point to the evolutionary benefit of virtue and value. Um, so that should be viewed as a reinforcing of uh, the best sides of religion, rather than as a refutation of religious experience.
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't think looking at a scientist who is now speculating in areas that are outside of his expertise is running him down. I mean, I think E.O. Wilson is fantastic, and he does have a very great and broad mind, and he does speak articulately about these things. But it's his methodological dogmatism that is where I have a problem. And I think this is something that many people who are in science and many people who talk about science do not see, and they cannot see it. So
Yeah, so I gotta, I've said a couple times in today's episode that I've read it and reread it and read it and reread it. So again, I'm gonna reread it and I'm gonna reread it with George Gantz's eyes because I want to see that enormously misleading methodological fallacy that's at play throughout the book. That's what I need to be because the more I'm reading it, the more enchanted I am with his approach, right? And I'm not getting on reread after reread, I'm not getting the fact that he's leading me down a garden path of, false promises and false hope. I don't get that what he's putting forward in this body of work is something that is, uh, it's either one of the two. It's either a bad actor or he's completely hubris of his methodology, right? It's either one of the two. He's either a bad actor or it's his hubris at play on display.
he's not a bad actor.
There we go. So
Not at
he's not
all.
doing anything unintentionally. He's not doing any. So it's just
Well,
completely.
it's unintentional because of again, I'll say it again, an article of faith that he brings to the plate
I know what.
in
How is it?
the
He takes it.
methodological reductionism. It's a metaphysical principle he
He
brings to the
sets the
plate.
stage at the beginning, saying exactly what it was. Is that it is the Ionian enchantment. He says right up at the front here, like it's like writing a paper and saying, "Here are my assumptions." Ionian enchantment. That's what he's saying right at the beginning of the book.
Right.
He goes, I
And
know that's the problem.
that's been my complaint all along. And
But
so,
why complain? You do a paper and you say, "Here are my assumptions," and then you do nothing but attack the assumptions. Well, that's what is based off of the assumptions.
but
He's
it undermines the value of what he's saying because of that Ionian enchantment. He's enchanted, and therefore I have to question his critiques of some of the areas of human enterprise and human knowledge. It's not something can be accepted because he's identified a bias, he's identified an article of faith, he's identified the framework he's looking at it in, and Daniel, I think you have that same framework.
I
So
know. I'm trying to get out of it, right? I'm
well,
trying to
yeah,
get
and
out of it, and it's very difficult to get out because I don't know how to get out of that. I honestly, my friend, I don't know how to get out of that. Like it's like he says it's the Ionian enchantment. I may fall into the same category, right? I don't know how to get out of that. How do you get out of it?
um, well, I got out of it after going through a period of depression and devastation um, and contemplation of things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem and conundrum of quantum mechanics, and also the disintegration uh, of the empirical from the interior human experience that, whether it's emotion, psychology, spiritual, that discontinuity and also the lack of a defining framework that can pull them all together. And I think that can only be done at what I would call a religious framework. So I'm a believer in science, but I'm also a believer in a coherent framework that explains and makes personal the reality of this experience. So, it is in any event, we are all called to make a leap of faith. I think we ought to examine what the tenets of faith are that we're bringing to the table, and I think we can evolve our uh, our uh, belief structures. We can be open to ways of seeing and thinking about the unity of all of this experience, um, and have an opportunity to change. I mean, Daniel, I was a strict physicalist in my 20s and 30s, and secular, anti-religious. Believed that all knowledge was going to flow from mathematics and science, and it took the experience of seeing the emptiness of not having, places where there are unanswerable questions, um, that can't be addressed with the empirical, tools. It just can't be. And if you want to be an integrated human being, you have to be able to put all those together.
Mm.
And I think that requires a religious answer. you don't have to call it religion. You can call it something else. I mean, humanism is a defining framework. It doesn't have the answer to um, creation, first cause. It doesn't have answers to those questions. But you can sort of sit in that and leave those mysteries of to the side, and live a full and positive life without answering that question. I had to answer that question. I had to answer the question of, why is there anything at all? And I find it laughable when a you know a quantum physicist, and I don't remember the name of it, the quantum physicist who was pointing out that because of the quantum phenomenon of probability down at the Planck level, things are popping in and popping out of existence, and therefore at some point the Big Bang happened and something popped into existence. That's not an answer. That's not an answer. So I think there's got to be a big frame for being able to contextualize our experience. And I am serious about trying to point out the deficiencies if you're approaching it simply from one side of the empirical frame. If you're only in the empirical frame, there are things that you're going to be missing, and you're not going to be able to answer it. And so I don't think there should be any antagonism. I think there should be a co-evolution, a process of collegial knowledge exploration. But we have to be able to look at our faith. If you have a faith in the Ionian Enchantment, Wilson has a faith in the Ionian Enchantment. That makes it very difficult to see the places where that's not going to address it.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. I mean, because I'm not going to be a man of faith, right? I'm just not going to believe in a fairy tale.
Well, can you accept the fact that there are others that do?
Yeah.
And that they have some, if you want to say they have a right to that belief, and it doesn't mean they're wrong. I mean, these are not subject to proof. You cannot prove that you're right. I cannot prove that you're wrong. You cannot prove that I'm wrong. It's not subject to proof. That's why it's a
no,
it's
but
a
I would.
faith.
But until we get out of what you talked about, until we get out of these dogmatic slumbers, I would frame it as that it's a heuristic. It's a useful heuristic. I can walk through my daily life, right, and see here up on the left-hand side where you got this little sign here that says Jesus, right? That's in my family's house. So I can pretend that Jesus is my best friend, that I'm walking through him with, and I've got this idealized human person that called Jesus Christ. I can imagine that. I can pretend, but let's not pretend that pretending isn't what it is. It's a heuristic. There's nothing real about it. Or there's real things that can happen with pretending. And that would be
the same can be said about believing in the Ionian Enchantment. I think it's a
okay. That's fine.
Creates blind spots.
There, we've hit it. Mm-hmm. We've nailed it. I'm okay with that. But your side has never said and agreed. You would never have the Pope stand up and say this is pretend zone.
But
a scientist would get up and say this is pretend zone. This is Ionian Enchantment. A scientist will say that.
All right. Well,
but a Pope will never get up and say this is pretend zone. They will never do that. And until they
Well,
do, but I
but
have like a,
you have scientists who have said religion is all bullshit. It's all bunk. You're all superstitious, you know. So I don't buy that. I don't
I know,
accept that.
and the fine line that I'm trying to walk is to say that it is a heuristic, right? It's useful in thinking about it. It's useful in describing it that way, right? It could add benefit to your life, right? Some more than others, right? But the dogma that 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 permeates it is it's I don't know what the word is for it. It's disingenuous. It's not honest.
Oh, but are you calling me disingenuous?
No, but
Well,
if I
so
were
so
to,
there's you know what you are characterizing as religion is not what I believe. You know, I don't believe in the sanctity of the Pope or the divinity of the Pope. I don't believe in that.
I think what we believe is actually fairly close and common, right? But I wish that the Pope, I would have this fantasy that the Pope would stand up and say, guys, this is all pretendville. He would never do that because people need to believe. They need to really, really believe. And the way you do that is you tell them that it's true. You tell them that it's a true in a real sense. You tell them that it's true and it's on not equal plane, the same plane as as science, right? There's people that think that the Earth is only 4,000 years old. Now, figuratively, I can imagine that's where humanity started to emerge. Yes, I can agree with that. I understand why that's a worthwhile heuristic to understand that our culture emerged 4,000 years ago. But to present it as fact is the problem that I have an issue with because
I don't believe
generations are
so.
thinking of it this
I
way.
don't believe in that. I agree with you that's a stupid, terrible mistake, and it's a dogmatic doctrine that has emerged because some people find it useful to believe in something really stupid, or else they've absorbed it from somebody. So I don't give credibility to a particular religious tenet just because somebody says it. So again, I make some um, I guess I'm not qualifications in terms of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it is not acceptable to believe in things that are demonstrably false. There is a way of thinking about the Earth being created 4,000 years ago from the standpoint of the same, just like solipsism. You know, you can postulate a creation myth that is entirely self-consistent, and that has dinosaur bones built into into the sedimentary rocks. Um, and you can't refute that, but you can also only point out that that's really inconsistent with a lot of things that are accepted as fact based upon observation and and analysis and rational thinking. So that's an irrational belief that I don't think anybody should hold on to. I also think the uh, uh, divinity of the papacy is an irrational belief that um, I can understand some people have it, but I don't think it's based upon uh, a true inquiry into the things that make your life work.
Yeah.
It's um, what we haven't talked about is what would a consilience of religion, a universal set of religious principles that are at the rock bottom best aspects of the best of what religion has to offer, what would that look like?
Right.
And so it's true, we don't have that. If we had that, I think, if I were able to articulate that, you and I would be pretty close
Yeah.
and would be comfortable with the differences and you wouldn't feel uh, I wouldn't need to argue that you are stuck in a dogmatism of Ionian enchantment, and you wouldn't need to argue that I was stuck in a dogmatism of, religious fundamentalism. So I think the extremes are both problematic, and I think the consilience that I'm hoping for is something which recognizes um, a place of mutual respect and acknowledgement that the differences between us are small.
Yeah.
The values we hold are pretty close together, and we may see this explanation, you know, slightly differently because I may have a religious explanation, and you will have either an empirical explanation or simply, I don't need an explanation.
Well, I can have a religious explanation. It's just the explanation that I think religious studies are fascinating, right? But I think, it's just the lens that we look at them through. But George, that's a wonderful summary, right? Because we're kind of at the top of the hour here, and today's episode, was about human nature, and I think that your summary just kind of pulled it all together, right? There's that is human nature. Our ability to have this conversation and to think on that frequency, in that metaphysics, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's unique to human nature. I had one thing that was posted on my website from a philosopher, Robert Hanna. He's doing definitions, and he posted something on abstraction. And again, it was just so, to me, I'm thinking I'm like writing a response to him and rewriting it, and it's too reductive. Abstraction is this wonderful ability that we have as sapiens. It's where our brains went, I think, expanded by a level of 3 times. We're the only species on the planet that can abstract the way that can abstract in quite the way that we do. We're very unique on this planet in that way.
Yeah. And another thing, I'm writing a post on the issue of randomness and the point that human beings are evolutionary evolved to see patterns. Because obviously, if there's a leopard on the floor, you want to be able to identify that. So we're built to see patterns, and one of the complaints is, well, that means we tend to see patterns everywhere, and so we can experience something that's random, and we can perceive it as having a pattern, and yeah, that's true. But if you're too skeptical, you can also miss seeing patterns, because patterns aren't necessarily uh, uh, clear. Sometimes you have the heuristics. You sort of have to make some certain guesses and hope that you're right. But our tendency to create patterns is built into the human psyche, and there is research that shows that children, generally around the age of 4 or 5, will identify a universal agency. The concept of a universal agency at work in the universe, which if that child has language for it in terms of their culture, will solidify into an understanding or a concept of God. And so there is a universal tendency, if you will, to a religious impulse that's built into our biology. And it's worth thinking about that and the way that has played out in the evolution of the human species over the last couple million years. And according to Robert Wright's book on the evolution of God, we would never have had civilization without religion, because it's what enabled values to transcend the tribe and become more generalized. Anyway, that's a topic for a different day.
No, but I agree with that, though. I mean, I agree with that. It's this idea of it's the same like we're kind of predisposed to learning a language. We're predisposed to learning like a metaphysics. And to have a unified metaphysics is something, especially that's cultural, transmittable through generations, is like we're predisposed to that.
Right. But that, because we're predisposed to have a religious impulse, doesn't necessarily invalidate that.
No, I never said it did. I didn't say it.
But many people do. They say, "Oh, well, we're predisposed to see patterns, and everything's random, so we're all mistaken." That's a very common theme that I've seen among some very sophisticated scientists.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Yeah, so you're not okay. I think I finally. Thank you. I had to twist at this for a while because I wanted to find out what the nuance of this was. So George is basically saying that. Just because we can describe, so you have a scientist A over in the corner that says, well, wait a minute, all this is just patterns. Reality doesn't look like this. But the translation is humanity. It is translating it. It is imagining it. It is part of the human condition. It is part of our human nature. And you have to accept the fact that we are one step away from actual reality because we're interpreters. That's
that's one thing. And I guess if you are a strict empiricist, then you're gonna stop at the door.
Exactly.
You're not going to generalize beyond the empirical evidence.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
But you need that imagination to get to the empirical evidence. Like, you really need that imagination. You need that creativity and
so accept the religious impulse that we have, and accept the fact that it, if it doesn't conflict with the empirical, it could be true. We just don't know. There's no proof one way or the other for it.
Okay, that's a good way to end it, I suppose.
Yeah. Tough stuff, really.
Well, with the human nature one is, I wanted to really, put some pressure on that one because, it's, nothing's going to happen, I guess, come out of this for personal growth if we just sit and agree with each other throughout an episode, right?
Yeah, that's where we push the envelope and start to learn.
All right. Okay, my friend. Until next week. Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you, Dan.